Our gospel reading this morning is taken from John's account of Jesus' life, the second chapter. And in this reading, John tells us how Jesus spared a family humiliation and showed himself to be God's righteous servant by turning water into wine at a wedding. Out of reverence for the words and works of Jesus, I invite you to stand for the reading of the gospel. John tells us, on the third day, a wedding took place at Cana in Galilee. Jesus' mother was there, and Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. When the wine was gone, Jesus' mother said to him, "They have no more wine." "Dear woman, why do you involve me?" Jesus replied. "My time has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Nearby stood 6 stone water jars, the kind used by the Jews for ceremonial washing, each holding from 20 to 30 gallons. Jesus said to the servants, "Fill the jars with water." So they filled them to the brim. Then he told them, "Now draw some out and take it to the master of the banquet." They did so, and the master of the banquet tasted the water that had been turned into wine. He did not realize where it had come from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew. Then he called the bridegroom aside and said, "Everyone brings out the choice wine first, and then the cheaper wine after the guests have had too much to drink. But you have saved the best till now." This, the first of his miraculous signs, Jesus performed at Cana in Galilee. He thus revealed his glory, and his disciples put their faith in him. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
I invite you all to be seated. Jesus drank a lot of wine. And this fact is kind of a scandal to some people. I heard a story once about a Roman Catholic priest who was flying across the ocean on a long flight, and he happened to be seated next to a pastor from a holiness church in the south. And they were getting along very well, telling stories and so on, until dinner was served, and the priest ordered a glass of wine. And he noticed that the other pastor just kind of scowled at him and went silent, and he said, "You know, Jesus drank wine." And the other pastor said, "I know he did, and I would think better of him if he hadn't." This is an issue in some churches. When I was in Uganda, I was teaching pastors who had been evangelized by a church that's part of that holiness movement, and I had to convince them that the word oinos in Greek means wine, not grape juice. That's actually the word from which we get the English word wine. And point out that in Jesus' day, without refrigeration, even if they had tried to keep it grape juice, it would have been wine pretty soon. And this was actually a good thing, because the water was not always very sanitary. And so very often in Jesus' day, they would mix some wine with the water to kill some of the bacteria. In fact, this is undoubtedly why Paul, in his letter to Timothy, tells Timothy, "Stop drinking only water and drink some wine for your stomach." But it's also a good thing for this reason. Life was hard. It was difficult and painful in Jesus' day, much more so than in our day. And wine was a gift. It was considered a gift because it helped people to feel a little bit better. In fact, it was known as the lubricant of celebration. The rabbis even said, without wine, there can be no joy. Not that people were encouraged to get drunk. Scripture condemns drunkenness. But it was considered to be a great gift from God, to be just a little bit buzzed. Still, we have to ask, why would John include this miracle in his gospel? I mean, the other miracles of Jesus are so dramatic, calming the storm and healing the sick. And yet John makes a point of not only including this miracle, but pointing out that this was the first miracle that Jesus did. And this is especially important to think about because John's gospel is considered among the 4 gospels the most theological gospel. That is to say, John wrote his gospel last. He includes a lot of teachings of Jesus that aren't included in the other gospels. He doesn't include the miracles in the other gospels, with one exception. And he includes 6 other miracles that aren't in there, and every time he includes a miracle, it seems to be followed by a teaching about Jesus, about his character. So today I want to talk about what's with the wine. What did this mean, this story, to the original readers, and what does it mean to us? And I want to point out 4 things, the first of which is that it means participation. That is to say, that Jesus, as God, participates with us. You might say that God is the type of person that you would invite to a party, and he would come, and you would be grateful for it. Notice John tells us Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. If you read through John, he hasn't collected all 12 disciples, but John himself was one of the disciples that were with Jesus at this wedding, and there were a handful of others. And Jesus' mother had also been invited to this wedding. There was certainly a common network of relationships, and it was this big event. And so Jesus' mother says to him, when the wine was gone, they had no more wine. I point this out because Jesus was participating in this wedding, not only physically, but emotionally. Because hospitality in ancient times, and in many places in the world today, is a big deal. A bigger deal than it is in our culture. Wedding feasts would go on for days, not just a couple of hours filled with small talk. It would enable both families to build strong relationships. It would enable the young couple to be welcomed in and thought well of by the whole community. It would show the love that the parents had for their children. Years ago, I heard a missiologist from Australia, Michael Frost, explain this. He said that a family that loved their children when their child was born would often set aside a cask of wine from that year's vintage. And the next year they would set aside another cask of wine. And they would keep doing this each year until when the child was married, say maybe 16 if it was a girl, they would have 16 casks of excellent wine. Not the everyday cheap bland stuff that they use to help with their water, but excellent wine that would show the love that the parents had for their children. And that means that when this family ran out of wine, it would be a disappointment to the guests. It would be a humiliation for the parents and for the entire wedding party. It would be a tragedy, an embarrassment. And yet, Jesus cared about it. Now, it doesn't sound at first like he did. In fact, when Mary told Jesus, I'm sure she told him because she knew he was both capable and compassionate. But I know in the King James Version, which I first read, it doesn't sound very compassionate. Woman, what have I to do with thee? The NIV, you'll notice, translates gune, woman, dear woman, because in context, it's clearly a sign of affection. Kind of like if I, call one of my brothers or call one of you, hey man, what's going on? But more than that, he says, still, why do you involve me in the NIV? My time has not yet come. And we know that Jesus was very conscious of the timing of his miracles, the timing of his revelation that he was the Messiah. And yet, Mary heard him not say no. Because she tells the servants, do whatever he says. She's banking on the fact that Jesus has compassion for these people. And that Jesus, among all the guests at the wedding, is able to do something about it. And this, I think, is one of the points of this story, is that God participates with us in our lives. That is, we might think at first that God doesn't care about our problems, but he clearly does. And he clearly is able to do something in his time and according to his will. He participates with us. That's one thing I think this story is about. Here's the second thing. It's also about purification. Purification, because notice what John tells us, that God provides the means of cleansing sins so that we can be together. He says, nearby stood 6 stone water jars, the kind used by the Jews for ceremonial washing, each holding 20 to 30 gallons. See, a lot of water was needed for a Jewish feast. People would have their feet washed before they came into the house, And then, before they ate, they would need to have their hands ceremonially washed from the tips of the fingers to the palm, and then from the palm to the tips of the finger, and then the ball, the fist, into the palm. And this was required so that they would be clean, not only physically, but spiritually. You notice that the Jewish people, if you read through the Old Testament, they had a lot of rituals that had to do with purification. Because when they were in the desert and God chose to be with them in the tabernacle, and then when they were in Jerusalem, God chose to be with them in the temple, one of the things that those rituals made clear is that God was holy, that he was completely perfect, and that you had to somehow have your sins, your defects, your failures covered up if you wanted to have fellowship with God. And that's why even at a wedding, they would have all of these jars of water for people to wash with. And those are the jars that Jesus tells the servants to refill, and they refill them to the brim, and then Jesus asks them to do the most bizarre thing. Take the wash water to the master of ceremonies and have him take a sip. The servants were, of course, servants, so they did it, but it had to seem just unbelievable that they would be asked to do this. And you notice what it does. It takes the ceremonial wash water, which is a sign of separation between us and God, and it turns it into a sign of fellowship. When you share a drink with someone, coffee or whatever, a beer, it's a sign of fellowship. And this is what Jesus converts in this story. Not just water to wine, but separation to fellowship. I was thinking this past week, the closest thing I've experienced to this in my life was, some of you know I spent part of a summer teaching English in China to English teachers. And one night, our team of 5 American teachers got invited to a banquet in our honor, hosted by the local Foreign Affairs Bureau. And fortunately, I was instructed ahead of time on how to handle this, because I was the head of our team, and we were seated at a table where on the opposite side of the table were the Foreign Affairs officers and their aides. And on our side of the table were our teacher team and a couple of teachers from the university where we were teaching. And as the head of our team, I was seated right across from the head Foreign Affairs guy. And what I'd been instructed was that they would, each of the officers, there were 5 of them, would toast us in turn, and then I had to toast them in turn. And by in turn, I meant I had to pay attention to who was number 1, who was number 2, he was over here on this far end of the table, who was number 3, he was on the other end of the table, who was number 4, and who was number 5. I'm glad that I was instructed that. And by toasted, I mean we had our choice of beer. It was American beer, and some excellent plum wine in a smaller glass, and then some rice liqueur that was, I don't know what proof. I chose the wine. It seemed to go down the best. And in order to truly honor them, you would say, "Gambé," and drain your glass each time. So all 5 of them toasted me, and I accepted the toast on behalf of our team, "Gambé!" And then I toasted each of them in turn, and on behalf of our team, and "Gambé!" And after that, it was freestyle toasting. So fortunately, it was like an 18-course meal. But over the course of a couple hours, I'm guessing I probably drank, 15, 17 glasses of wine. I kind of lost count. But here's what it did. By the end of the meal, the number 1 Foreign Affairs guy and I, we had become friends. He didn't speak any English, and I didn't speak any Mandarin. But we were friends. In fact, we held on to each other and helped each other down the stairs when it was time to leave. Which was such an interesting experience, because we were strangers. We didn't speak the same language. We came from very different cultures. We, by all rights, could have been adversaries, and yet over the course of a meal together, we became friends. And I think that that's part of the message of this story. That God sent Jesus into the world because we could be adversaries. We could be strangers. And yet he desires fellowship with us. And that requires our purification, which was what Jesus came to do. Not through what we did, because our washing would have to be repeated again and again, but through the washing of his own blood, his own sacrifice. Now, beyond that, I want to point out this story is also about provision. Provision, because if you added up those large stone jars filled with water that had now become wine, we're talking about maybe 180 gallons of wine. And you'll notice it wasn't the cheap stuff. It was, according to the master of ceremonies, who should know, the best. The master of the banquet tasted the water that had turned into wine. Then he called the bridegroom aside and said, everybody else serves the best wine first, and then when people have started to get a little tipsy, then they bring out the cheap stuff. But you have saved the best for now. Kind of reminds me of years ago, there was an AT&T series of commercials, and I remember one where there was a surgeon doing surgery, and he asked for a certain instrument, and the nurse handed him the wrong one. He said, this should do. And then he reached in, and he made a cut, and he said, close enough. And the tagline on the commercials was, good enough is not good enough. But isn't that the case with God? Isn't that one of the things that we learn about him in the Bible? He didn't just come to make our relationship with him okay or even good. He came to make it the best. Paul says God provides for us beyond all that we can ask or imagine. And I see that in this story. Jesus said, I have come to bring life and life in abundance. And I see that in this story. And he traded places with us on the cross so that we wouldn't just be God's servants or not even citizens of heaven, but that we would be God's children. That we would spend eternity with him in heaven. That we would be able to have a close relationship with him now as Abba, Daddy, the one who knows us better than anyone else and provide for us things that we don't even know that we need. I don't know if you remember this. Last year in February, there was a story about Willie's chocolate experience in the UK. It was, I guess a new Wonka movie had come out about Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, and it promised an emergent experience for families and their children. And the tickets were $44 a piece, but parents sold out because their kids were so excited. And, I thought about this. I was kind of creeped out by the first Willy Wonka movie, but I remember seeing that big room with a river of flowing chocolate where you could just pick candy off the trees, and I thought that would be awesome. So I can see why people would invest in this, and there were children dressed up as Willy Wonka, and when they got to the warehouse where this thing was being held, they went through this beautiful ornate gate, and there were a few set pieces in this warehouse, just a few, and there wasn't actually any chocolate for the children. In fact, if you made it to the back end of this big warehouse, they were offered one jelly bean and a quarter cup of store-bought lemonade in a paper cup on a bare table. And there were a few actors dressed up, but I saw a video of it this last week, and children would come in so excited, and then they would start to get confused because it was a mostly empty room, and then some of them even started to cry, and the parents called the police because they were robbed. And the company ended up having to refund the tickets. The guy who was in charge of it, he totally went dark and disappeared from the scene. And I thought, kind of a metaphor for a lot of things we go through in life, isn't it? That we think are going to bring us such joy, such fulfillment. They're all going to be wonderful. And then we get there, and they're just not what we had hoped they would be. And in contrast to that, we have God and the description of what he's prepared for us. A relationship with him that we know we don't deserve, that we can't earn, and yet he gives it to us for free because he loves us that much. An eternity that's beyond just floating around in airy nothingness. It's this great symphony of sound and this incredible, intense colors that can only be described in jewel tones. It's this amazing time, but best of all, we're reunited with God. The big chunk of our hearts that we sense when we're honest about it is missing, is suddenly there. See, this story is about provision. And it's about one more thing, which is power. Not only the power that Jesus had to manipulate nature, but the power to move hearts, to create faith. Because that's where John goes in telling this story, isn't it? He says, this, the first of his miraculous signs, Jesus performed in Cana in Galilee. He thus revealed his glory, and his disciples put their faith in him. You know, in English, it kind of sounds like they finally decided, they checked out this Jesus person, and yeah, we'll follow him. But that's not what the Greek word really means. It means to come to trust or to be drawn to believe in something. In other words, it's kind of a passive word. And you'll notice that John always calls Jesus' miracles signs. He always calls them signs. Why? Because they're not just to impress us. They're to impress us about the character of God. They're a sign of who God is and what he's come to do. Years ago, I had it pointed out to me, you know the story that Jesus tells about the Good Samaritan? It's one of his most common parables, right? And it's about this guy who gets beat up by robbers and he's left for dead by the side of the road. And the religious authorities cross to the other side of the road. They won't touch him. They don't want to be made unclean. But then a Samaritan, this hated half-breed that the Jews despised, came along, and he took pity on the man. And I always thought it was about, you know, we should be good Samaritans, right? We say that all the time. We should have compassion on people, which is true, but it occurred to me, after somebody pointed it out, that Jesus himself was called a Samaritan by the religious leaders. He tells this story to the religious leaders. And he himself had been called a Samaritan because he was an outcast. He was a rejected one. They hated Jesus. And Jesus is the one who lifts us up. He's the one who brings us back to life. He's the one who takes us to an inn, as the Good Samaritan did, who pays for our healing, who pays for our care with his own life. This is the power that we have to believe in him, and in believing in him, believing what he says, to actually imitate him. I want to close with this quote. I just have to. Martin Luther wrote once that beer is made by men, wine is by God. And I point that out because it's literally true in this story. But I also point this out because what's with the wine in this story? Well, it's a sign. It's a sign of God's character, that he has come to participate with us in life. He's come to purify us by his own blood. He's come to provide the best for us and empower us to believe in him, in Jesus. Amen.